Welcome, Tracy. Hi, Kira. I hope I get that right. Hi, Kira. Welcome. Hi, Kimberly. Welcome. DFL Precinct Chair. The DFL had a big day today. Hi, Anne from Minnesota. Okay, I think it is now 7 o'clock. So I think we will get started. We've got kind of a big agenda here this evening. We've got some special guests. So welcome again. We are streaming on Facebook. If you are seeing us on Zoom, you do not have to go to Facebook. My name is Ann McGarry. I'm a volunteer with OFA Minnesota. OFA is a nonpartisan progressive grassroots network of volunteers that has been fighting for years to move our country forward. OFA does two things: mobilize and organize. OFA mobilizes grassroots and supports grassroots supporters to win key issue fights. We are organized at the community level, engaging, training, and empowering a new generation of leaders. This evening, we are going to hear from speakers to address redistricting for a fair democracy. You will have the opportunity to ask some questions of our speakers. Again, please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and we will make every effort to get to your questions. And I believe we are ready to go. So let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Jose Morales Jr. He's the Community Engagement and Projects Director at the National Redistricting Action Fund, the 501c4 affiliate to Attorney General Eric Holder's National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Jose previously worked at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and at the New Organizing Institute. In addition to voting rights, he has a passion for economic justice, LGBTQ rights, and DC statehood. Jose grew up in the Bronx and Monroe, New York. He graduated from American University in 2013. Jose, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Anne, for the awesome introduction. I'm super excited to be with you guys. As she said, this was a very big day for you all, I'm sure. So I wanted to take the time to talk a little bit about what we're doing here and hopefully take some questions from you guys if we have time. If you haven't heard of the National Redistricting Action Fund, it is, as Anne said, the affiliate to the NDRC. And us and our affiliates are working on the hub strategy to tackle redistricting and anti-gerrymandering efforts across the nation, whether that be through litigation, supporting ballot initiatives that reform the redistricting process, reconnecting, rebuilding, or propping up some long-term infrastructure and strategy. Stuff around the census usually falls in this bucket, and thinking about the map drawing techniques that we as citizens need. And then there's the electoral impact, which is what the NDRC works on. And that's kind of the whole shebang, if you will. We were recently very, very involved in the Arizona and Ohio efforts. I think a lot of folks know about Ohio passing a ballot initiative, but what folks might not know is that the citizens of Arizona just snatched a great victory. There was some tomfoolery in the state legislature where they were trying to push a negative reform of what is truly a gold standard in terms of independent redistricting commissions. Arizona has one of the fairest maps and has one of the most open processes. Ohio didn't have that a couple of months ago for their congressional process, but they just passed what's called Issue 1. We worked with a lot of people on the ground, national affiliates, and other citizens who were reclaiming that power, trying to get citizens back into the redistricting chair, and that passed by a huge margin. So we were really excited about that, and we plan on doing more of this work, especially as ballot initiatives continue to grow in importance this year, 2019, 2020, and beyond. So where OFA and I fit in is not just a great friendship, but a partnership. We are working with OFA as a huge partner to get folks involved in the races, efforts, and basically make sure you all stay updated on not just what's going on in Minnesota, but what's going on across the nation in what has become a very energetic year for good government reformers. So if you use that link right there, if you can't click on it, don't worry, you can type it. It works all the same. We'll get you plugged in if you haven't been already. So I want to stop there and see if I can take any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Jose at this time? Okay, let's see if we can go back. We are getting a request to go back one slide. People would like the link again.
Awesome.
Again, any questions, just go ahead and type them in the chat box.
Thanks for pasting that, Tracy. That's awesome. Thank you.
All right, Jose, can you see those questions? We do have one. What are some ways to tell gerrymandering from fair districting?
Oh, that's a super good question. Yes, I see that. There's a lot of research and ideas out there. No one has come up with as easy a standard. That's one of the cases right now that's expected to come out of the Supreme Court over the next couple of months. If you've heard the term efficiency gap, that's one way of measuring it. But the way we tend to view things are delegations of the state legislature and Congress showing way different results than, for example, what we call top of the ticket action. You all know the presidential happens every 4 years. That's when most folks turn out. But even when it's not the most folks who turn out, does the amount of votes, like is it 50-50 in a swing state, translate to something like a 60-40 or 75-25 lack of representation? That's when we started to identify what's gerrymandered. I'm sure you've seen like very serpentine districts or districts that look like hyperbolas. I think I get 5 statistics points as an adult for remembering what that word was. Any kind of weird looking thing is automatically suspect, although it's not always gerrymandering. And also, you know, we want to make sure that folks, the communities of color, new immigrants, folks whose first language might not be English, they tend to compact in cities, and making sure that they're not packed into districts that dilute their voting power. That's another insidious form of gerrymandering. And then I see Anne asks, is there a state that does redistricting properly? Arizona is one of the best, really. And I know it's also a really big primary night in California. They have a crazy commission process, which if you have an extra 15 minutes in your life and want me to run you through it, happy to do it. I don't think this call is the right time for it, but they employ independent commissions or bipartisan commissions that prioritize a lot of the needs I just went through a couple of minutes ago, and also have a really open, transparent, citizen-informed process that takes it away from politicians who have parochial interests and making sure they get to keep something for them, and making sure that the voters are accurately represented by not only submitting maps, but going to public forums, getting a chance to testify and meet with commissioners. So those two states do an incredible job. And I believe Iowa, Idaho, and Washington State also use a similar commission.
Okay. I don't know if you want to grab those last couple questions.
I have time for one more. Redistricting in Ohio right now is a split process, but in 2021, it will be different. In 2021, they'll have the state legislative lines. So when they draw the lines for their state house and their state senate, it'll be drawn by a committee with their governor, state auditor, state secretary of state, and then 2 representatives from whichever party has the most seats in the legislature, and then whichever party has the second most. So typically it's Democratic, Republican, depending on how well they've performed. And then in the congressional, it's a little bit of a different complicated formula where, yes, the legislature gets first crack at it, but they need significant 2/3 approval from whichever party is in the minority. So that forces a collaborative, deliberative process. There are a couple of fail-safes, including that same committee. That was issue 1. If you want to learn more about it, we'll have some information about it on our website soon. If you're interested in that kind of Ohio process, another great free resource that kind of breaks it down for folks is Ballotpedia. And they have a wealth of information for folks who really want to know more about how the states work. I don't know that I have time to get to every other question in here, but what I want to give y'all is my email address. It's Morales, my last name, at democraticredistricting.com. So if there's anything else burning, or if you want some tidbits of knowledge, please feel free to email me. I basically live on my phone. So I would love to get to know more of you. And I'm so happy y'all let me talk to you for a little bit today.
Jose, we really want to thank you for your time. We do appreciate it. Great information. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
All right. Bye-bye. Okay. Our next speaker is Anastasia Belladonna Carrera. Anastasia is the Executive Director of Common Cause Minnesota. She previously worked as Legislative Director for a Minnesota state agency, the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs. Prior to working for MCLA, Anastasia held various leadership roles within local, state, and federal government. She is focused on advancing intergenerational socioeconomic equality for all Minnesotans. She has a BA in sociology and earned her law degree with a concentration in constitutional law and civil rights from William Mitchell College of Law, and her master's of management is pending her dissertation. Welcome, Anastasia. The floor is yours. Technical delay. Please hold. No, we can't hear you. Hold tight, everyone. All right. While we're waiting for our technical difficulties to get solved here, if you look in the chat box, there are some email addresses. Jose's email address is available. Also, Jose mentioned the Ballotpedia. That is a really good resource if you want to go to that. And then the Democratic Redistricting website is there and as well. So we have a lot of information. And when we get to the end, there will be a slide that has some additional contact information available to you. So we will get to that. And I will just give you a heads up at the very end. There is a brief survey that we'd like you to take. And let me see, Anastasia, we're not there yet. All right. And I don't know, Tracy, if there's going to be a recording. I'm assuming not. Anastasia, do you want to use my laptop? I think we have a fix. Oh, there will be a recording through the Facebook group. Stand Up Minnesota's Facebook page will have a recording of this.
Where is?
And there we are. Anastasia, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you guys so much. This is what I love about, oops, sorry. This is what I love about organizing. Lesson 101 in organizing, roll with it. All right, so we're gonna roll with it. Thank you guys so much for being so patient. And I'm giving the shout out to all our democracy champions out there. What we're gonna do for the rest of the time that we have is really take a couple of different looks at the redistricting process, right? So when we say redistricting, what are we really talking about? So we're talking about essentially one of the three major cornerstones of our democracy, okay? The other two would be the allocation of seats and also the census. So what we're going to do is that we're going to focus more on redistricting, but we're going to be visiting each one of those as they interact or interrelate to the process of redistricting. In doing so, we're going to make sure we hit a couple of key points. And I'm going to also be stopping along some of the natural pauses to make sure that if you have questions, you can go ahead and throw them into the chat box. They're going to be feeding me those questions so that I make it a point to address them as we go along. So some of the things that we really want to make sure that we hit particularly is that you understand the following key points. Now, you're not going to necessarily know, perhaps depending on where you're at, particularly what is involved at the wonky level of these things, but I most definitely want you to know enough to be dangerous. So really know how to engage and interact and be able to do so with confidence, right? So we're going to be looking at the differences between redistricting, gerrymandering, and apportionment. We're going to talk about the types of gerrymandering. We're going to talk about why that's such a bad idea and a bad process for the redistricting process itself. We're going to go into why the census matters. I mean, what is really the big deal? You've been hearing a lot of buzz around census questions and perhaps an intentional intent to compromise that process. So we're going to look at why. Why is there so much attention on that particular aspect of our democracy? And what more importantly, does that have to do with democracy? The threat to Minnesota. What do we really talk about when we say that? In light of the national patterns that you've heard about and also around Minnesota needs. Where can you find these resources? Who are going to be your allies? More importantly, I really want to focus on what you can do. So bombard us with any questions you have at any point of the presentation that speaks to that particular issue itself. So we're going to move on now with that. You're going to see that I am making it a point to hit some highlights here. Some of the highlights that we're going to talk about in particular is what I mentioned lastly. Who are your allies? Well, some of your natural allies are going to be the individuals that are sponsoring this very same webinar. It's going to be Common Cause Minnesota. It's going to be OFA Minnesota. It's going to be Stand Up Minnesota. It's going to be the NRAF. And more importantly, it's going to be the individuals that you never even thought as allies in this particular subject content of redistricting. So who is really Common Cause Minnesota? Let me just check in on that so that you can see what you're able to tap into when you work with an organization such as Common Cause. So we're a nonprofit organization. We're a national organization. We're about a little over a million nationwide. We've got offices situated in about 30 states. There's a couple of volunteer boards that run a couple of 2 or 3 other states as well. In Minnesota particularly, we've gone from 11,000 to 17,000 strong in just a year. And what we really strive to do is simply uniting ordinary Minnesotans, ordinary individuals such as you and I, and empowering you to make meaningful changes at your community level. I know that it's really sexy to look at all the stuff that's going on nationally, but what could we really do to move reforms or to be more engaged in our local environments? So let's start with what is the purpose of redistricting? Like, why do we redistrict? What's the big deal about redistricting? Well, as I had mentioned, redistricting is actually one of the cornerstones of our democracy, and that's a pretty big claim to make. But as you're going to see as we go further and further into this exploration of this particular topic and process, why it is that I say that. So redistricting is really intended to ensure fair democracy so that it's nonpartisan. It must be nonpartisan, right? More importantly, it's to maintain a fair and equitable balance between the state, perhaps Minnesota or Texas, as we're going to see, or Ohio. It's to ensure an equitable balance by preventing a particular geographic area within a state. So you've always heard here in Minnesota the conflicts between greater Minnesota versus the more urban Minnesota and so forth. Sometimes it's regional. Sometimes it's the East Coast versus the West Coast with regards to apportionment. It's to ensure, more importantly, that every single person's vote counts, that you matter. You here in Minnesota or you here wherever it may be. The bulk of this conversation that we're going to have today is really about that you and I, the we, the collective we that is we the people, right? The foundation of our democracy. So the redistricting process really highlights that particular thing to make sure your vote and mine counts, that our voices are heard through our vote. It allows for the reapportionment of the US congressional state House seats. There's 435 of them, right? So redistricting itself at a larger perspective happens every 10 years, right after the census. And there's that other cornerstone we talked about earlier, right? I said it was the foundation of our democracy was based on key cornerstones: redistricting, reapportionment, and the census. So here comes the census. And the census, as we know, is just about counting heads. This happens every 10 years. We do that because we need to redraw boundaries of electoral districts. I call them voting maps, because when we start thinking about the wonkiness of, political districts or this or that, already we start injecting that political aspect into what we're really talking about. And what we're really talking about are forging voting maps that are based on census data. This process of redistricting impacts local, state, and national government. So I'm not sure if some of you might have been aware of a particular project that took place back in 2010, right around that time, called the Red Map Project, right? And that project was all about how the Republican Party sat down and tried to figure out, well, hey, how can we influence this process of redistricting at a very core fundamental level? And one of the first things they did with that was get into the issue of redistricting at a school board level, a very fundamental level. So we've talked a little bit about redistricting, a little bit of the overview of redistricting. We've already started talking about the census and how does that engage this process of redistricting? Well, we already know that the census is actually the data and information that the redistricting process is going to look to as it moves on to allocating what that district might look like, right? We'll get into that in just a few minutes here in a little more detail. But now here it pops up again. So an apportionment is the process by where a state's voice at a national level is determined. So we said there were 435 seats, right? So that means of the 435 seats, how many does Minnesota get? We currently have 8. There's been a lot of debate about whether that number is going to change by 1 or will it increase? Well, the census is going to determine that. And the debated question of whether or not we're going to lose a seat or not, suddenly we start hearing the state of Texas popping into that dynamic. So as we continue to ebb and flow through this, you can see how the census is really a core part of both apportionment and redistricting. And later on, we're going to talk about the differences between redistricting and apportionment. Apportionment lays the foundation for how redistricting will adjust geographic maps in a way that it accommodates for a state's loss or gain. So it's sort of the tweaking aspect of that, right? But more importantly, as you know, there are other states that have 12 members of the US House of Representatives. We have 8. Some have 1. So that is going to tell you the political equity of sorts, the voice of what each states will have. Now, this is a natural pause that I spoke to earlier about questions. This pictograph literally shows you the cycle of our democracy. And as you can see, the census is front and center there at the top. It is through the census information, literally the counting of heads, that we get into and delve into the flow of redistricting. And it is through redistricting that we then also flow into apportionment. And then through how those are drawn, we get into voting. And actually, I'm going to make a correction on this PowerPoint. This is what I said about organizing. Sometimes we got to roll in the second. Actually, the correct flow is census apportionment redistricting. Why is that? I'm going to take a quick few seconds just to make that side note there so that I don't confuse you guys, and then we're going to pause for questions. And I love questions, so please get them rolling. The reason why apportionment is first is because apportionment is how the federal government will allocate how many seats of the U.S. House of Representatives goes to each state. In turn, the states then, through its state constitution, goes through the process of redistricting that shapes what those geographic districts are going to look like. So if you think about that, it makes no sense if you're going to put redistricting first. Just checking to make sure that we do that common sense check as well. So just to be clear, census information is collected and then it's reported to the president. The president then certifies that information and it gets reported back to the states, right? While this information is being reported to the states, the federal government is already trying to figure out, okay, well, have there been state growths or decline in population that would justify us removing a member of the House of Representatives or adding a member to the House of Representatives, right? The other process that happens in the state is, okay, now that we know we have 8 congressional districts, how are we going to divide those out? And that's where your state legislative body comes in. How many districts are we going to have in Minnesota based on how many of the larger congressional districts we have? So I'm going to stop here and see if anyone has any questions. So far, we've talked about those 3 key pillars, those 3 key cornerstones of our democracy: redistricting, apportionment, and the census. We've talked a little bit about how the census really lays that foundation for apportionment and redistricting to be carried out in a way that's equitable and fair. And if you noticed, nothing in this discussion talks about how the Democrats are going to do this or how the Republicans get to do that, or how it's the Green Party that does this or the Libertarians. This process is meant to be void of partisanship. Questions? All right, don't be shy. I'll take any question. I know enough to be dangerous, so don't be shy. All right. So then I must have done a really, really good job because nobody has any questions. That's okay. We're going to roll. So fantastic question. Someone asked, what happens if the census is underfunded? That is a fantastic question. So let's just take a couple of minutes to really think about that. So the census is about counting heads. That too, by the way, is mandated by our United States Constitution, and all states must participate in that process. What would happen if there was an undercount? Well, interestingly enough, when you look at traditionally disenfranchised individuals from our voting system and process, there is a huge overlap between those that are traditionally undercounted and those that are traditionally disenfranchised. And so when you have either the compromise of the integrity of just a simple counting of heads, right, by either a lack of leadership, as we currently have in the US Census Bureau, where it still does not have a director, or a lack of funding, right, within state process, so that complete count committees and other key stakeholders are not able to coordinate the work that is supported by the state demographer's office for each state to carry out the census work and make sure that, for example, counties are appropriately registered into the LUCA system. And the LUCA system is the system that updates addresses, because in 10 years, there might be housing developments in areas that previously were just farmlands or just wooded areas. And vice versa, there might have been a complete complex that has been bulldozer down, and now it's a parking lot. So this is a system whereby each county uploads an audit essentially of their addresses, but all that takes staff time and money and resources. So what happens when the census is compromised either in leadership or in funding is that, well, what does the 10-year cycle tell you? It's going to tell you that if the census is literally the base for which we start assessing whether states increase in the allocation of US House seats or decrease, and then you further think about that, and now you're talking about redistricting, where it's literally the drawing of geographic lines, right? Part of that is that those geographic districts have to be as equally portioned as possible. In other words, you can't have District 62A with 50,000 Minnesotans living in it, and then have District 62B with 150,000. It's got to be more or less the same equitable number, depending on, natural ravines or other natural things, or certain geographic, literally physical things that may require a line to be drawn in a certain way to capture pockets of population in that state. So if all this happens based on the census, now you understand the controversy. Now you know why the census has become such a heatedly controversial topic. And it's more than just an issue of the questions that go on there. There's another question. Okay, so the question with apportionment and, say, immigrants living, would that be in a particular area? Okay, so the census is not, again, the census is about counting heads. It's not about counting citizens only. So when we look at a population, we look at a population based on the numbers. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Minnesota is a very diverse community with regards to our communities of color, and also within our immigrant population. We've got Russians, Canadians, we've got Latinos, we've got Africans, we've got a buffet of a variety of different immigrant populations that make the fabric of who we are in Minnesota. So question, when this issue of should we count citizens or should we just count heads, which is what the Constitution requires, then I usually ask myself, well, okay, well, the census is also used not just in redistricting and in apportionment, but also in allocation, equitable allocation of resources from the federal government to the states to maintain things like highways, schools, infrastructure, basic infrastructure, where hospitals are located, where trauma rooms may be opened up, nursing facilities with memory and dementia type based on the population, because they know that X number of individuals with this particular issue around dementia lives, and therefore that would be a great place to put one of those centers to give good quality of life. Well, then my question becomes, Do immigrant populations not wear and tear our highways and our infrastructures? Do they not walk into buildings and contribute to the wear and tear of the buildings? Do they not live in a community and also have the wear and tear of our hospitals and our schools and so forth and so on? So I think to limit the census, or to try to politicize the census, which again was instituted by our founding fathers, by the way, as a means of ensuring equitable representation. And by representation, I don't mean a voice. Representation is a voice and access to resources. So I hope I've done a good job with that question. I had a last one.
What is the best method of redistricting so there's been any party?
So the last question I'm going to take before I move on is, what is the best model of redistricting that's out there that would really minimize the influence of partisan interests and so forth? And we're going to hit on that particular subject in a slide here in just a little bit, a couple of minutes. But for purposes of this question right now, I think the answer to that is one that removes the ability of those that have the interest in manipulating the process from the process. And in this instance, in Minnesota, the Constitution in Minnesota requires that the Minnesota legislature oversee the process of redistricting in Minnesota, which means that under our Constitution, the only way to be able to remove members of the legislature from that process is either to move with a constitutional amendment or come up with a redistricting model that I will speak to very briefly in a different slide that would essentially take the process of redistricting to an independent redistricting commission, but it would bring back the final maps for a thumbs up or a thumbs down to the legislative body. And in that way, it would not need a constitutional amendment because the legislative body would still be engaging in that process, much like, you know, the legislative body is mandated to oversee a whole bunch of different aspects of governing, and chunks of those roles or functions or even duties that are allocated for in the Constitution are oftentimes delegated to state agencies. So it wouldn't be that unusual for an independent redistricting commission to function similarly. I had a Facebook question that said, do you know if I can see how many people are on this particular web? No? I'm sorry. Oh, it's that question. It's the question on top. Okay, so here we go. 1 or 2 easy to understand action items. Facts on redistricting I can share with less political friends and family. Absolutely fantastic question. And we've actually got a couple of slides dedicated just to that. So I'm going to move on with the presentation and talk about how does redistricting actually impact you. And this, for the person on Facebook that had that question, is actually going to be a good way of maybe framing some of that discussion with family and friends that may not have a lot of knowledge or even really know what redistricting is about or why it's important. Most people really respond well to what does it have to do with me? How does it affect me? So this is how it's going to affect you, quite frankly. It's going to literally change the borders of your district. Now that is going to be important to you. For example, I'm going to give you an example that kind of highlights all these points here. Let's say that I'm in District 1A. My son goes to District 1A school. Our home clearly is located there. My friends and neighbors, we grill, we talk about different things all the time, and they're in that district. No worries. Well, here is 2021. And Anastasia suddenly gets a new little notification that she is now in District 1B. And I'm like, what? 1B? 1B is literally maybe sometimes either across the street or sometimes a couple of blocks. Could be a mile or two, right? But this is the important thing about that. Guess what? My son is in a school that's not in District 1B. So the community that I'm going to be engaging around issues of education, situations I may come across at the school, is now in a completely different district. I may have a good rapport with my senators or my representatives in that district. And now I find myself that I have a completely different person who may likely someone I don't even know. Or maybe I was in a district where I felt supported because the person that was elected into office was someone of my own party. And now in District 1B, it's a completely different party. And I don't even know how to relate to that person, right? It can also change the characteristics of the voters in the district. It could be based on racial or diversity, education, poverty levels, right? It can also have to do with an issue of competitiveness of districts. And that is actually something that I find to be particularly concerning in Minnesota, is the issue of competitiveness. So let's look a little closer on what has been Minnesota's redistricting process and why we particularly need you, our democracy champions, to really stay engaged and to really be involved, right? One of the important things is a no-brainer. Jiminy crickets, Minnesota has not been able to pass any fair maps, redistricting maps, for I don't know how many different redistricting cycles that we've had, right? And why is that? Well, two key things. One, because it's members of the legislature that get to do this, right? And unfortunately, if you've been following what Minnesota's legislative sessions have been gravitating, more and more polarization, more and more stalemates, more and more gridlock, right? Guess what? Our redistricting process is delineated through a bill just like any other bill. So it is part of that hyper politicized deadlock and gridlock that you have been seeing getting worse and worse and worse with each session that goes by. And as such, the governor is able to veto that. And if the governor vetoes it, right, if there's a stalemate, as I just mentioned, which has been the case in the past, if there's any violation, like major, blatant, in-your-face violation of constitutional provisions, the Minnesota State Supreme Court steps in, right? What's really interesting about this process is that given the importance and the magnitude of what we're talking about, because in Minnesota, not all states do this though, but in Minnesota, we're able to do both congressional districts and state house districts. So it's 2 for 1 here in Minnesota, but there's no need for a supermajority. And a supermajority is literally just 2/3. And I know some of you might have heard that term even this last session, because when the governor vetoed a couple of bills, they actually tried to get together and try to come up with a supermajority to pass these bills. And unfortunately, it didn't work out. But guess what? For say, I think one of them was the spending supplemental bill. That didn't work. But in Minnesota, we don't need one for the redistricting bill, which in my opinion, and of course I'm biased, is way more important than the supplemental funding bill. That's just me though. How does redistricting happen? Well, I just said that the Supreme Court has stepped in, and pretty much that's been the default for the state of Minnesota. When the Supreme Court does that, what it does is that it goes through this process that we've outlined here. It goes through setting up its own redistricting panel. The panel is retired judges, and they're 2 and 2. So what I mean by that is that the House majority and minority, so in this case, it would be Speaker Dowd and whoever, I believe it's Melissa Hortman, who is still going to likely be in those positions in 2019, I'm not sure, or whoever is in place when redistricting goes through. And then in the Senate, it would be the same. The House lead and the House minority lead would pick 2. So now we have a total of 4. Those 4 judges then meet and they pick a 5th, a tiebreaker. After they go through that, they start identifying a process of holding a series of public hearings. Last time, I think they had 6 of them throughout the entire state. The key thing here is that they do not start from scratch, okay? They essentially tweak the maps that have already been drawn and saved, essentially, from the legislative process. The important thing about this is that during these public hearings, you and I are able to submit map suggestions of our own district. And as a matter of fact, Common Cause Minnesota put together a parallel independent redistricting commission to just kind of model for folks that this can work. And believe it or not, we actually had our maps taken into consideration by the Supreme Court and utilized. And these were just everyday people like you and I. These, you know, the folks that sat on our independent redistricting commission were just everyday Minnesotans, as it should be. So I want to take some time here to reflect real quick about what can really happen. What could really happen when things go wrong with redistricting? And I think this quote here does a good job of summing that up in a nice way. When things go really wrong in redistricting, it's called gerrymandering. And to be more specific, it is called political gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is a partisan inequity. It is not concerned with fairness. It specifically provides unfair advantage to either the party, particular candidates or particular incumbents, or it can even be used to punish members of their own caucus. It will influence whether or not your elected officials respond to your needs. So when you think about the outrage that we hear on CNN and other channels that speak to how on earth can, for example, how on earth can it be that 90-something% of the United States population believes in some kind of stricter gun reform, and yet, there you have it. That's one of the reasons. Candidates in this process of gerrymandering essentially pick their voters. They get to sit back, look at the map in their own districts and say, hey, based on some really fancy software that could really tell me a whole lot about how you shop, what magazines you get home, how did you vote in the past, patterns of that district of the past. It can even get down to the type of car that you drive and who really leans what way because you drive a Volkswagen versus a Ford Explorer. I mean, it's ridiculous the kind of information they can get. This allows for candidates and incumbents to pick their voters instead of us picking our elected officials. The 4 more common types of gerrymandering is cracking, packing, hijacking, and kidnapping. I'm telling you, half of the struggle, folks, I tell you, half of the struggle is just keeping the earpiece in your ear. Okay. So the 4 types of gerrymandering, of these 4 types, the top 2, cracking and packing, are mostly used by individuals to literally isolate a given group based on race or economic standing or political leadings, and essentially dilute their collective political power. So in cracking, it's just like it says. It means taking a particular group and literally splicing them out. So if you think of a pie and you think of splicing, you know, of cutting up that pie into 8 equal pieces, right? And in the center of that pie, you kind of bullseye, say, all the people that dress in pink. Well, if I want to minimize the impact of all the people that dress in pink have, all I do is literally make sure that I have cut into that bullseye into all the different pieces. So as you're removing pieces from that pie, you're literally taking a little bit of all the population that dress in pink. And now they no longer have that collective political power because they're only a little teeny tiny spot. Now in packing, it's the exact opposite. What happens is that I will take, say, of the 8 pieces and concentrate all of the people that wear pink in only 2 of those slices. And the rest of the slices are mine. And I get to do whatever I want with them. Hijacking and kidnapping are typically utilized to punish, quite frankly, either incumbents, usually it's incumbents, or candidates that parties don't want. These are examples. I just wanted to make sure you guys had a sense of how this looks. These are just examples of what packing might look like if you see that's hyperly packed in these big old chunks of populations in Cleveland. And this is actually Ohio, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. These are actual real life examples that are being currently challenged in court. This is cracking in Texas. And as you can see, it's shaped in all kinds of very weird and interesting, hurtful looking shapes. So I'm going to highlight very quickly what this really looks like nationally. And I think we did a good job of also highlighting this in that example I just told you about with the stricter gun reforms. So this is what a congressional legislative election looks like when the voters' desires are not reflected. So if you look at the average presidential vote, you kind of see in Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, again, all states that have, as I had mentioned before, issues, challenges, constitutional challenges to redistricting right now as we speak, they seem to be fairly even Steven almost. But when you look at the congressional delegation and then you slide down to the current state legislative, look at that. It is not just a little tweaking this way or a little tweaking that way. It is blatantly chunking that out. And that is how you get policy decisions like a lack of some kind of reform in the NRA situation with gun control and stricter gun rules. And you still get the same core of people sitting in Washington, D.C. talking about how, nope, we're not really ready for that yet. When the entire population is saying, hang on a second, how is this happening? Yes, we do want it. Let's bring this back on home. Let's look at Minnesota. I kind of hinted at this earlier, the lack of competitive races. Well, I pulled up a recent 2018 report. You're going to have links to a lot of these resources. And the Cook Political Report indicated as follows. If you look at the national section there, it's telling you that out of 435 seats, and I'm just going to check my notes here real quick just to make sure that I've got this correctly up there. Only 13% of national U.S. House of Representative districts are competitive. 13%. That's 57 seats, folks, out of 435. 205 are safe seats for Republicans, 173 safe seats for Democrats. In Minnesota, it's a little better. Not much, but a little better. In Minnesota, it's 50%. 50% of the districts are considered competitive. Republicans have safe seat in one district, which was CD6, and the Democrats have strongholds in CDs 7, 4, and 5. So only 4 of those seats are actually competitive. So this brings us back to my previous hinting of what is it that we can do, no matter where we are in the discussion around redistricting. You don't have to be a wonk to make a difference. There's 2 key things I want to highlight for you here real quick. The only thing that stands in the way of political gerrymandering and the injection of partisan agendas and special interests into our democracy, let's revisit. Redistricting is one of 3 key cornerstones of our democracy. That's a big deal. That's something I really want to continue to emphasize because it's super, we're talking about literally a foundation of how you and I engage our government, how we hold power accountable. Redistricting should be void of any and all partisan agendas. It is something that belongs to we, the people, the you and the me that collectively makes that we, the people. We are the only thing standing between complete partisan warping of something that belongs to us. So you and I have a lot that we can do. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. We were just talking about that here. You can't see all of us, but this is a picture that says it all. Okay? No matter, I have no idea if the folks, you can't tell by looking at these folks whether they're Republican or Democrat, and that's a good thing. Because this is not a red or blue issue. This is a me and you, we the people issue. But more importantly, this shows you that these people, we, ordinary, everyday people, can actually move reforms, even when our immediate surrounding may say, nah, I don't think so. The polls, how many upsets haven't you seen already? But the polls say one thing. We have a president that the polls said one thing. And against all odds, we had states that went DFL, that historically have been GOP, that the polls said there's no way that they can do this. And I'm going to share something just right here in our own office, in our own home. Under a Republican-led House and Senate, with the chair of the state government finance actually authoring very bad policy on redistricting that did not allow for an independent redistricting commission or you and I as everyday citizens to engage that process, we were able to rally and stop her bill in her own committee. We did that, you and I, everyday Minnesotans. And if you really think about it, how on earth can we, how did that happen? The House is dominated by the Republicans, the Senate, Republican majority. How, oh, and by the way, Governor Dayton did not veto it. It never even made it into the final spending bill. We choked it before it even got there. That's the power of we the people. We can do this, but we need to stay engaged. We need to be active, consistent, and ruthlessly engaged. So what are some of the things that we can do? We have an entire House that's up for re-election, folks. They will not be back unless you and I vote them back in. They can't be back unless you and I vote them back in. They work for me, they work for you. We, right? And if we stick to the issue and not the partisan aspect of it, it doesn't matter whether I'm a Republican and you're a Democrat or a Green Party or Libertarian or whatever. It's basic, it's 101. If you go to work and you don't meet performance expectations, you get terminated, or at minimum, you get pipped. When are we going to start holding our electorals to the same standard? The second thing is ask them specifically to support an independent redistricting commission. Get them on the record. This is a beautiful time. Please, I'm begging you. This is the time to go to the meetings, the town halls, work with OFA, work with Stand Up Minnesota, work with Common Cause Minnesota. Get connected to our resources, get connected to our calls to actions and our meetings and so forth. And make sure that you go on the record. Make sure that you ask the candidates, all the House members that are up, all the governors that are up, all the Senate. We've got a Senate seat. Senator Smith is about to run and other candidates are running. Stay informed, talk to your family. When you engage folks, don't engage folks to debate. Engage folks to just have a conversation. Just start with the, hey, what do you think about redistricting? Oh, you don't know about redistricting? Let me tell you what it's about. It's one of the cornerstones of our democracy. You can use our PowerPoint as a way of engaging them on just the basics of it. Write op-eds. Some of you are amazing writers. Write op-eds. Write in your local church bulletin. Write in the newsletters, in your communities at the Y. And more importantly, get out the vote. Please, get out the vote. Doesn't matter who you support. If it's a GOPer, do it. If it's a DFLer, do it. If it's a Green Party member, whoever it is, as long as they voice your principles, as long as you've had those tough conversations with them and make sure that they do share your values, that they do support redistricting, that they do support a healthy census, that they are aware of these issues, that's what we want. Door knock, phone bank. Here's a list of take pledges. Make sure that you give people rides to the polls. Make sure that when you fill out your census that you do a buddy check-in, right? And you check in with your neighbors. Partner with Common Cause. If you've got your cell phone now, get your cell phone out. Text cause, just the word cause, to 9777779. Get calls and actions and updates on that. You can go to our website, Google us, find us. And now we've come to that sad part of the presentation where you guys just get to start asking me questions and we get to start winding down.
Okay, again, if people have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box. You might want to type quickly. We're going to run out of time here. Maybe while we're waiting for questions, let me just say, first of all, thank you very much, Anastasia, for the incredible insight and knowledge that you've provided us. That is really fabulous. If we could go to the next slide, there's a slide that we have that's got a lot of contact information. And if people are looking at ways to get involved, here's a ton of contact information. Again, still not seeing any questions. So let me just do one other quick thing. If you are wondering what you can do and how you can carry off all of this action, there is a call to action this coming Saturday, June 9th. Join us for electoral training with OFA. It will be at the Minneapolis Labor Federation. All the details are provided. There's an RSVP there on the screen. There will be a follow-up email that will provide additional information. And if you've joined us this evening through Facebook, follow-up information will be available on the Stand Up Minnesota Facebook page. There's also additional resources on the Stand Up Minnesota Facebook page. And there's an RSVP in the chat box as well, where you can RSVP for that. And I do believe we are currently now out of time. So we do want to say a big thank you to our guests, Anastasia, Jose. This has really been fantastic. We also want to thank our hosts for the evening, Stand Up Minnesota. There is a survey. We would like everybody to just take a second and complete the survey for us. And I think that gets us out of time. So thank you all so very much. We hope this was beneficial to everyone. Have a good evening.